In this video, we'll be talking about declarations and definitions in C++. Even though they sound similar, they are actually different. A declaration tells the compiler that a certain type or function exists somewhere. For example, here we have declared and defined a integer of name myInteger, and we have declared a function called SumFunction. By declaring a function, we know that it exists, and that is enough to be able to call the function and use it. Here, we have declared a function add that takes in two integers and returns an integer. We have not defined this function though, because there is no function body. However, we can still call this function because it was declared. On the other hand, a definition is different for variables and functions. For variables, it tells the compiler where the variable is stored. For functions, it tells the compiler what the function actually does. For variables, declarations and definition happens at the same time usually, and so you don't have to think too much about the difference. So here, standard string hello, this is both a declaration and a definition. The only time when there is a difference is when you use the extern keyword, which declares but doesn't define the variable. One use case is for declaring global variables in a header file. Don't worry about this though, as it's not something that should be used much. To see the difference between function declarations and definitions, let's look at an example. At the top, we have a function declaration, int add, that takes in two ints. However, because there's no function body, we don't know what the function does, and this is not a definition. At the bottom, we have int add that takes in two ints a and b and returns a plus b. This is both a function declaration and a definition. The function body tells me what the function does. Function declarations and definitions are usually separated. Declarations go in .h files, and definitions go in .cpp files. For example, if we wanted to declare and define a function add, then we would put the declaration only in an arithmetic.h header file, and you put both the declaration and the definition into a arithmetic.cpp file. Remember the video on headers? The reason why we include .h files and not the .cpp files is because the .h files contains the declarations, and those are all you need to use them. For example, here we include arithmetic.h because the header file contains the declaration. And because we have this declaration, we can call the add function. The important thing about declarations and definitions is that multiple declarations are fine. For example, here we have the arithmetic.cpp file, and which includes arithmetic.h. And the add function is declared inside this header file. However, at the bottom, we have a declaration and a definition of the function add. Since we declared the function in both the header file and here, that's 2 times in total. But because multiple declarations are fine, this will not result in a compiler error. However, multiple definitions will cause an error. This is called the one definition rule. For example, if instead of including a header file, you included a CPP file, then there would be 2 definitions, breaking the one definition rule and causing a compiler error. In this example, in file A, we include arithmetic.cpp. This contains both the declaration and definition of the function add from earlier. In file B, we include arithmetic.cpp, and again, this contains the declaration and definition of the function add. Now, because we've got 2 definitions of the function, this will result in an error, multiple definition of add. Something important about declarations and definitions is that namespaces can be used to separate variables or functions that have the same name. This means that declarations and definitions need to be in the same namespace, otherwise they refer to different things. For example, at the top, we've declared a function add in the namespace arithmetic. At the bottom, we have defined a function add, but this is not the same add as the one in the namespace arithmetic. As a result, if you try to call the function add in the namespace arithmetic, then you would get a compiler error telling you that the arithmetic add function was not defined. The correct way to define the function add in namespace arithmetic would be to write arithmetic : add. Something that's tricky about defining variables is that there's something called initialization. That's a separate thing. Initialization for variables provides the variable with its initial value. A variable that is not initialized has an indeterminate value. For example, in the first line, we have int x. This is declared and defined, but has an indeterminate value. In the second line, int y equals 5. This is declared, defined, and initialized to 5. In the third line, we have int z. This is declared and defined, but again, it has an indeterminate value. And finally, in the fourth line, we have z equals 10. Here, we are assigning z to the value 10, but this is not an initialization. Initialization only happens during the definition of a variable. Using a variable with an indeterminate value is undefined behavior. For example, here we have int a, but this has an indeterminate value, as we have seen from earlier. As a result, when we try to stream a to standard C out, we don't know what value will be printed. So when does initialization happen? A definition does not necessarily result in initialization. For types like int, bool, float, and double, you need to initialize them, unless they're a global or static variable. For other types, they will be initialized for you. However, it's always a good practice to initialize all variables to prevent the risk of having a variable with indeterminate value. For example, we have standard string myString. Because standard string is a class, this is default initialized. At the bottom, we have int x. Because int is not a class, this has an indeterminate value. How do you initialize a variable? There are many ways of initializing a variable, but for now, we will assign a value when defining the variable. For example, standard string myString equals hello. Int x equals 10. Bool is initialized equals true. In summary, declarations and definitions are different. A declaration tells the compiler that a certain type or function exists somewhere, and knowing that a function exists is enough to be able to use it. A definition, for variables, it tells the compiler where the variable is stored. For functions, it tells the compiler what the function actually does. For variables, declaration and definition happen at the same time usually, unless you use the external keyword. For functions, declaration and definitions are usually separated. Declarations go in the .h file, and definitions go in the .cpp file. Multiple declarations are fine. Multiple definitions, however, will cause an error. Declaration and definitions need to be in the same namespace. Otherwise, they refer to different things. Initialization for variables provides the variable with its initial value. A variable that is not initialized has an indeterminate value. And using a variable with an indeterminate value is undefined behavior. A definition does not necessarily result in initialization. For classes, they are default initialized. Otherwise, they have an indeterminate value. And finally, there are many ways of initializing a variable. One way is to assign a value when defining it.